Welcome everybody to the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing here at Lancaster. Today is the first of two word and image seminars that we're going to have this year, and that is going to be featuring two colleagues, Dr. Jo Carruthers on the Bible and the Art of Execution, and Professor Benoit Peters on words and images in Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes. Both are going to present for around 20 minutes, then we'll have questions, and we'll finish on the 2 o'clock mark. Okay, so first then, Dr. Jo Carruthers, author of England's Secular Scripture and the Islamophobia and the Protestant Aesthetic, and Esther Through the Centuries, and most recently, The Politics of Purim, Law, Sovereignty, and Hospitality in the Aesthetic Afterlives of Esther. So Jo is going to speak to us then on the Bible and the Art of Execution. Jo.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. I'm just going to share my screen. So there you are. Hope you can all see it okay.
We can indeed.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to be looking at the Book of Esther specifically in this paper. Esther is a neglected book in Christian tradition, but a central text in Jewish communities through its relation to the popular festival of Purim. The story of Esther is set in the ancient Persian Empire and tells the story of the king's minister Haman, who orders the execution of all Jews across the vast empire of the Medes and Persians. And Esther is instrumental in saving the Jewish people, and the story has become closely related to narratives of genocide, with Haman commonly understood as a Hitler figure in recent reiterations. An archetypal enemy then, Haman has become iconic, representing malicious threat to Jewish livelihood and life. So what I'm going to be thinking about today and looking at are the scrolls of Esther and the illustrations. So Jewish communities traditionally read out the story of Esther from a rolled up scroll like the one that you see on the slide here. They read the whole story out loud in the synagogue service, and this is central to Purim festivities. And the congregation symbolically eradicate Haman's name by shouting, stamping, and banging every time his name is read out loud, drowning out his existence with noise. Now, Esther scrolls are extant from the 17th century onwards. The scroll that you can see on the screen here is one of the earliest illustrated scrolls from 1618, and it's held at the John Rylands Library in Manchester. The scroll illustrations also partake in the execution of Haman. He attacks the Jews, but then meets this terrible end. He's hung. The scrolls are renowned for their ornate illustrations, as seen in this handwritten and hand-illustrated scroll and hand-coloured. For home and synagogue use, these illuminated scrolls, like illuminated Bibles, amplify and engage with certain aspects of the biblical story, selecting certain scenes to depict and expanding on visual detail. These images are interesting to me in various ways. In many Esther scrolls, the images reflect associated legends and creative expansion found in rabbinical writings, the Midrash, telling a slightly different story to that found in the written narrative. They therefore work alongside and separately often to the written text. They are readable, and my guess is that they are often read alongside a remembered story, the words on the page often not engaged with when the pictures are being read. Like the relation between a Christmas nativity scene and the biblical narrative it is drawn from, they might put elaborate attention into details like the animals around the crib or the 3 kings that don't exist in the scripture, but have become part of festival or mythological tradition. The earliest dated scrolls date from the 17th century, as I've mentioned, and in each scroll in its individual country reflects the art and architecture of its time. Scrolls like this, just to let you know, they're read from right to left, just like the Hebrew in which the narrative is written. So my focus in this paper is on the art of execution. The fact that in the vast majority of extant scrolls, the image of the hanging of Haman and his 10 sons, who are all complicit in the attempted murder of the Jews, This execution is a prominent and sometimes the only illustration. It is also the illustration that impedes into the text itself. These handwritten manuscripts follow rabbinical dictate as to layout. And this is where the relation between visual layout and significance begins. The part of the writing that receives the most attention formally is the hanging of Haman and his 10 sons, the execution ordered by the king to punish them for their attempted murder of the empire's population of Jews. So here's a close-up of that same image. The names of the 10 sons are to be written on top of each other, like, the Midrash tells us, a half brick over a half brick and a brick over a brick, rather than tessellated in a typical wall structure. And this produces an unstable structure, easily toppled. The significance of this list of names does not end at the physical object, but is carried on into ritual practice as well. The cantor or synagogue reader of the scroll is meant to read the list of names in one breath. The rabbi suggests the format is because their souls departed together. And Louis Jacobs offers a humane suggestion that the Jew is encouraged not to gloat over the defeat of his enemies by getting over the reading quickly. However, the focus and attention on the act of execution itself makes this humane suggestion slightly unlikely, I suggest, as the visual effect of the list is long-lasting. It is in this column of text that images of the hanging of Haman and his sons frequently occur. The breaking of images into the narrative panels expands the semantics of the form of the lettering itself and are, in a way, a logical extension. Many of the scrolls seen in the PowerPoint here present elaborately drawn gallows that reflect the brick-over-brick style of the writing and are visually elaborate, even excessive. The height of the gallows are somewhat unbelievable. But we also get these nice little details sometimes, such as the men that you can see at the bottom here holding this long ladder for their friend at the top. So an example of a scroll in which Haman's hanging is included in the main text is in this Polish scroll from the 18th century. It's housed in the Jewish Theological Cemetery in New York, and it's rendered in brown ink and watercolour, and it's decorated by foliage, birds, and a geometric interlace, as you can see. The artwork that runs across the top of the border contains human figures, including angels and trumpeters, and as shown in this image in the top corners, nude couples. Animals appear within the bottom border of the scroll, while above and below the text column, contained in rectangular frames, are images from the Esther narrative explained by micrographic inscriptions that identify each scene. The Esther story itself is contained within an opening and closing page of blessings. As the scroll unfolds and towards its end, an image is found in the central text column. Here are the 10 sons of Haman, and the 11 men hang, ensuring the observer's engagement with the execution. The hanging is framed by the two images of the romantically and even sexually engaged couple in the top corner panels. And the images of execution are therefore set against images that invoke a romantic version of the story, perhaps influenced by the more romantic rendering of the story in the Septuagint, the early Greek translation, and the kind of Catholic versions of the apocryphal Esther. They may depict Esther and the king, or the king and the many virgins who are gathered to the palace for his selection of a queen, or perhaps suggested by the unhappy look of the woman's face on the right-hand panel, maybe Haman's lascivious attempt on Esther in the story that preempts his condemnation. No matter what specific narrative element they refer to, and there are kind of multiple possibilities, they magnify the sensual elements of the story and setting. The contrast perhaps serves even more poignantly to intensify the moment of execution. Death sits beside fecundity, and fertility also suggested by the ornate and excessive foliage in the scroll's vertical borders. Here, pleasure is contrasted with lifelessness, making even more stark the opposing fates for Jews and their persecutors. Other interesting narrative, kind of pictorial juxtapositions are present in other scrolls. So here's another example from the John Rylands Italian scroll, where we find naked women in the corner panels. So this could refer to the virgins who are brought to the palace for the king, or to a midrashic legend that Vashti, the queen who is queen before Esther, gets her Jewish maids to serve her naked. But an interesting kind of narrative here, in the sense that we have an image of Jews worshipping as part of the narrative of the story, but they look like they're actually looking at the naked women. So perhaps a kind of comical interpretation or imposition by the artist here. In my book on Politics of Purim, I argue that this attention on execution is in line with Derrida's argument about the visibility of the death penalty as a sign of sovereignty. Writing primarily about revolutionary France, Derrida argues that the death sentence stands as a sovereign decision of power and makes sovereignty visible and assured. So Derrida writes, "The state, the polis, the whole of politics, the co-citizenry, itself or mediated through representation, must attend and attest. It must testify publicly that death was dealt or inflicted. It must see die the condemned one." For Derrida, then, the moment of execution produces the sovereign self. He says, in the instant at which the people, having become the state or the nation state, sees die the condemned one, that it best sees itself, becomes aware of its absolute sovereignty. And interesting here, I think, is the kind of enlarged eyes of the onlookers here, that this kind of seeing die of the sovereign community. So Derrida suggests a relation between the performance or visibility of execution, the gaze of the co-citizenry, and the self-identification or reassurance of sovereign power. In the Politics of Purim book, I argue that these illustrations act as visual dissensus or disruptors of the status quo, in order to produce a sovereign self-identity for the celebrating Jewish communities at Purim, who would be politically and socially marginalised, if not persecuted, in the context of 17th century Italy and Holland and 18th century Germany, in which these scrolls were produced and read. What I want to look at today is to think about how writings on comics can shed light on how these images function. And I want to look at a couple of scrolls whose illustrations are especially cartoon-like. So this is an Esther scroll housed at the Glasgow University Library Special Collections, and it resembles the folk art of various scrolls, German scrolls, and its provenance hasn't been identified by the library beyond dating it to the 18th century, and not much work has been done on this scroll at all. As reflected in a comment I found on Twitter, the image of execution here is disconcertingly cheery. The bright reds and greens of the surrounding foliage and columns set a suitably festive mood for Purim, as the decorated gallows and the three figures are dressed in red. The close-up of the faces here demonstrate their resemblance to the simple, clear line style of drawing in comics. In order to understand these faces, I want to draw on the writing of Scott McCloud, the author of Understanding Comics, The Invisible Art, in which he explores the significance of the simple comic face. He argues that the simplified facial form, such as we see here, resembles our internalized self-image of our own expressed emotions. So when you talk to somebody, you express emotions on your face that you cannot see, but you have an internal picture of your own expressive face. So he states, when you enter the world of the cartoon, you see yourself. So this image most closely represents your internalized image of your own emotional expressions. He argues for a universal identification with any and all comic faces, that we read ourselves into the subjectivity of each represented character. As such, the simplified physiognomy of the cartoon face, he argues, is a vacuum into which our identity and awareness are pulled. My question in the light of McCloud's arguments here would be, how do we interpret the blank stare of the Haman figure? So the image of the Haman hung figure looks out at the Purim participant observing the scroll, I would argue. The same is true in this German scroll from 18th century. And we saw it also in the Italian scroll that I showed earlier. So here again, we have this kind of blank face looking out at the observer. And just to demonstrate that these facial images, I think, are blank rather than just crudely drawn, I've included an image here of another scene in this scroll in which the faces are decidedly unhappy, so kind of downturned mouths and raised eyebrows. So I have a few suggestions, but I would welcome your responses to what you think is going on here. So my thoughts are that the blank face of Haman could suggest a refusal of emotion or affect for the villain. Whereas other figures in the scroll are allowed to express sorrow, Haman himself is refused expression, so it diminishes his agency. Alternatively, the blank face could suggest resignation to his fate, that he realises that he deserves what he's getting. Or it could suggest an ongoing malignity, a continued contempt, staring out at the viewer. My last suggestion returns to Derrida's claims about the sovereign reassurance enacted when the citizens see die the condemned one. There is a refusal here, I think, for the observer to see die the condemned one, who instead stares back. This is not so much a refusal of execution. There's no real question in the story that Haman dies, but rather a returned gaze. I would suggest that this returned gaze implies an ongoing threat, that Haman as an iconic figure of threat is thought to reappear in every generation, and this stare represents that sense of persisting threat against the Jewish population. Haman retains an agency that fits in with Jewish fear of threat at the same time that his execution promises divine sovereignty and group sovereignty over that threat. This juxtaposition of threat and triumph perfectly sums up the atmosphere at Purim, which reprieves and thwarts threat. This last reading also works alongside the symbolic meanings attributable to the physical object of the scroll. Part of the festival service involves unrolling the scroll and then folding it up so that it resembles a letter, referring to the letters that the villain Haman sends out in the name of the king, ordering the slaughter of the empire's Jews, as well as the letter that's sent out ordering the Jews to celebrate in Purim. The scroll moves from a cylindrical shape, a common symbol of cyclical time, to folded space. These shapes imitate the nature of festivity itself. The repeated annual festival, lived over and over again like a genocidal Groundhog Day, becomes again a sequential story before it is rolled up again and returned to its casing to be brought out again the next year. Okay, so those are my thoughts, but I'd be really interested in the questions to hear any of your thoughts about how to interpret these figures. Okay, thank you. I'll now return control.
Thank you, Joe. That was wonderful, wonderful. You can imagine, as ever, all of that. Thank you, wonderful. We will move then across now to Benoit before we have conversation. So Professor Benoit Peters, another colleague, is not only a celebrated graphic novelist and historian of the visual image and biographer of Derrida, but did his MA under Roland Barthes. So who better to talk about words and images in Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes? Benoit.
Hi, everybody. I will share my screen and show you some images. So only a few words about this very strange book by Roland Barthes. I had a personal knowledge of Roland Barthes. I was a student. I remember perfectly when the book Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes appeared in 1975. As you maybe know, in the 70s, Barthes wrote different texts which are not critical texts and which were working with images, in connection with a lot of images. The book about Japan, that you have also in English. Of course, the book about photography, his last major book, La Chambre Claire, Camera Lucida. And for Barthes, there was in that period a specific interest in the relationship between words and images. It was a constant preoccupation in different texts writing about images and writing with images. So this is a quotation, the longest that I will read. Something I like to do very much is establishing particular relationships between text and image. I have done it more than once and always with great pleasure. I'm fond of writing captions to accompany pictures. What I like above all is the relationship between image and writing. A very complicated relationship, yet for that reason also a very cheerful and creative one, not unlike the pleasure classic poets used to find in solving complex problems of versification. The modern equivalent of these challenges is to find appropriate relationships between text and image. This statement is very interesting because in that period of French theory, French modernity, there was a sort of suspicion concerning the images, and there was the idea that the text was sufficient, and there was a real risk to put images with the text. And Barthes worked in another direction in different very interesting books, but for me the most interesting in that direction is the Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes. Here is the cover of the original edition, and I will comment it later. But this is how the book appeared in a specific collection by Éditions du Seuil, a famous collection at that time of smaller books, relatively cheap, Écrivain de toujours.
Ben, we've not got that yet. I think we've still got the Empire of Signs, #3 image.
You are still on. You
We
don't
can see #3.
Oh. I will try differently then.
No worries, no worries. There we are. Excellent.
Let's try. Do you see?
It's just gone blank. We did have it. Now it's just a white space.
White space, no.
Nothing.
Let's try again. It worked a few minutes ago. It should work.
No worries.
Now?
Yeah, we've got the camera Lucida book image now. Yeah.
Okay. Let's try
#5.
Okay.
We got #5. Yes. Lovely.
Okay. This was Camera Lucida in English.
Correct.
And the quotation that I read a few minutes ago.
Correct. Perfect.
So let's continue. You don't need to see the text, but this is the original cover in the collection by Éditions du Seuil, Écrivain de toujours, which was very famous at that time, and later I will comment this very specific and important cover. So the book was translated, but when it was translated, it was in a different context, which is very important to understand this specific book. This collection, Écrivain de toujours, so writers forever, or something like that, existed since the beginning of the 50s, and very good writers wrote about other writers, and you can see image and text. So this was part of the concept, to combine a critical essay, some quotations, and some images. A book about Proust by Claude Mauriac. And Roland Barthes himself published in this collection his second book about Michelet. This was the original version, 1954. And there were a lot of evolutions in the editorial context and transformation of the object. But at a certain moment, the collection was considered as old-fashioned, and a writer, a poet, Denis Roche, very much interested by poetry and photography, became responsible for this collection at Éditions du Seuil. And he wanted to make it more modern, to make it different. And there was a general book about Les Surréalistes, one book about Le Nouveau Roman by Jean Ricardou, famous theoretician. And then he had the idea to suggest to some writers to write a book about themselves. And he suggested this to Roland Barthes, which was a very strange idea, and Barthes at the beginning was not sure that he wanted to do it. Was it possible to write a sort of essay, or critical essay about himself in such a collection, Writers Forever? And you can see on the project for the cover how small he writes the title of the collection. And he thought maybe it would be infatuous to write such an essay. So he tried for months and thought maybe I will not do it, and then decided to do it. We have a recent seminar published called Le Lexique de l'auteur. I don't know if it was translated, and there we see all the approach of the book through his teaching during 1 year. And this cover is very important. It's a drawing by Barthes, but at that time nobody knew that Barthes was drawing, was a sort of amateur artist during the summer. And this is called Souvenir de Juan-les-Pins, a small town in the south of France. And it was a way to avoid a representation of the author, because he thought maybe Roland Barthes as a title by Roland Barthes, this was certainly enough. And a portrait of the author would be really too much and impossible to accept in that context. You have to imagine that middle of the 70s, the idea of the author and authorship was fighted, and by Roland Barthes himself in the death of the author, as by Michel Foucault and some others. So this was strange, but you had to take it with a lot of precautions. Every element of the book was conceived by Barthes, and these are the first 2 pages with the handwriting and very famous sentence: tout ceci doit être considéré comme dit par un personnage de roman. It must all be considered as if spoken by a character in a novel. So to create a sort of distance, and as you see, to use the handwriting after the drawing. To draw, but nobody knew maybe at that time that it was by Barthes. You had to look carefully at the book, and then the handwriting, which was always very important for Barthes, even if in the book about Japan. And then we open the book, page 4-5, and we discover a picture, but it's not a picture of Barthes. It's not a portrait. It's a portrait of a woman, but we cannot know who she is. And as you can see, there is no explanation, no text. You will find it in very small letters at the end of the book with all the credits, and it's a picture of the mother of the author, of the mother of Roland Barthes. It could look like a simple detail, but it's very strange, because this image is totally mysterious and solitary at that time, and it was 5 years before Camera Lucida, the book about the presence and the importance of his mother in his life. So we can consider it here as a sort of light provocation. And then the first part of the book is full of photographs, old photographs connected to his childhood. And in the second part of the book, in the major part, we will have almost no pictures, no images. So the images are concentrated in the 50 or 60 first pages of the book. And here a translation of the beginning of this text, the first line, the first paragraph. To begin with, some images. They are the author's treat to himself for finishing his book. So for us, for the reader, at the beginning of the book, but he first wrote the whole text and then put this first part. His pleasure is a matter of fascination and thereby quite selfish. I have kept only the images which enthrall me without my knowing why. Such ignorance is the very nature of fascination, and what I shall say about each image will never be anything but imaginary. Image, imagination, imaginary. And here we find again a picture. In fact, it's the same woman. It's the same woman with Roland Barthes as a child, but we don't really know it. We can imagine it. And the text is La demande d'amour. So asking for love is very general. And of course, for every reader, it can be something more personal, the relation between writing and desire, writing and love, which is so important for Barthes in the last part of his life. And what seems very interesting to me is that to work with the images, Barthes had to write in a more literary way, to forget the critical discourse and to try something very brief and more poetic with a personal connection to those objective images, pictures of the city of Bayonne, where he lived as a little boy. So I read this first caption for the left page. Bayonne, Bayonne, the perfect city, fluvial, aerated with sonorous suburbs, Mouzerolle, Marac, Lâche-Paillet, Berris, yet immured, fictive, Proust, Balzac, Plassans. Plassans is related to Zola. Primordial image board of childhood, the province as spectacle, history as odor, the bourgeoisie as discourse. So you see, those short sentences, sometimes which are not real sentences, give us a new style in the work of Barthes. We have found some elements of this style, this literary style, in L'Empire des Signes, but here he's really inventing something new. And in this double page, the two grandfathers, and you see how he organized the page. Of course, we can think that he did it with his editor, with Denis Roche and some other person at Éditions du Seuil, but it's clear that he wants to compose it as a whole thing with those very short text with the same length for both of them. And about the first grandfather, in old age, he grew bored, always coming early to table, thought the hour was constantly moved up. He lived further and further ahead of time, more and more bored. He had no part in language. And of course, the other text is in connection with this one. So there is this type of poetic composition that Barthes evoked in the quotation I read before. And so the sister of his father, the father who died at the beginning of World War I, And it's just a short suggestion. Never is Barthes speaking about his father or the absence of his father in the rest of his work. And there is this only page in his whole work. And then at the end of this first part, I've only shown some of the pages. There is the idea that the palms of the trees are the beginning of writing. They are like letters or words. And so we will go from the images, from the childhood, from the poetry with Heinrich Heine here, to the writing and to the novel with a very different style of writing. The image repertoire will therefore be closed at the onset of productive life, which for me was my departure from the sanatorium. He was 27 years old approximately. Another repertoire will then be constituted, that of writing. So here we find again a sort of opposition between writing and image. The images were the most important part in the first half of the book, and in the second half we will have all the possibilities of writing, and there we find the first portrait of Barthes. So it's not only the combination between text and images, but it's also the whole organization of the book. And we can see that the very small caption on the page is the word gaucher, so left-handed. And when you just add one word, it changed a lot the meaning of such a photograph. Everything can be changed by one single word. And then in this part of the book, the images are directly connected to writing, the manuscript by Roland Barthes. So we continue, we have the printed page and suddenly the body of the writer or the hand of the writer. Here we are at the end of the book in perfect symmetry, with the beginning of the book writing with white letters on the black page, and this sentence, et après. Quoi écrire maintenant? Pourrez-vous encore écrire quelque chose? On écrit avec son désir et je n'en finis pas de désirer. And afterward, what to write now? Can you still write anything? One writes with one's desire, and I'm not through desiring. What happened in the following years after the death of Roland Barthes was a series of small or not so small transformation, and certainly Barthes would have been horrified by this cover in the 80s, because there we have écrivain de toujours, just in front as a major element. It was very discreet in the first edition, and then the face of Barthes, the title Barthes, the name of Barthes as an author, a triple redundance, and no possibility for the image to say something different. So you see that changing a cover in such a book, which was conceived as a piece of poetry or piece of art, is changing something fundamental. And later, recently, they had the good idea to have a new cover going back to the drawing, but we are now in other collection and we don't feel all the games that were connected to Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes in his first edition. Now we have the idea, we can feel for younger readers that Barthes wanted to write a book about himself, and then the risk of being infatuous is already there. And we see the same thing in many foreign editions. Something is destroyed, and here also Barthes, dit Roland Barthes, so we forget the Roland, we and we add the picture, which was normally in the middle of the book. Same in this edition, the idea that we need to see the face of the author and to forget this subtle and friendly return of the author as a body that Barthes wanted to promote in the end of his writings. He has something more abstract, but it's another sort of destruction collection. Barthes, Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes. This is a little too much, and we forget the beautiful colors and the joy of the mysterious drawing. There were other type of editions in different sizes, and every of those transformations destroyed some element of the book. Of course, it wasn't possible to publish it as a perfect facsimile, but I just want to insist on the fact that a certain type of book is very difficult to separate from its first context of publication. Here in this edition, we don't know why, but they prefer to put more elements on each page, and you can see the page with the two grandfathers. Something was destroyed. In the first edition, we had one text under the image and second text upper the image, and so here the idea that you have to reduce the white space, it gives something that it's not as interesting as in the first book. So we see here the original version. Of course, in poetry, when you have a poetic book, you need the white space and you need to respect the composition. We cannot imagine that we will put it differently. So I will I don't know if you can see me.
Yeah, we can see you. Yeah.
Okay, so it was just to consider that as a writer, Roland Barthes came from critical prose to a form of more literary writing, and that images and composition of the book and organization of the book were very, very important. But all this stuff is very fragile and maybe impossible to separate from the first context.
Thank you. Thank you for another wonderful paper. So we have 15 minutes for conversation. So let me open the floor, as it were, to anybody that would like to. Thank you, Joe, for rejoining us. So please just raise your hand electronically, and then I'll invite you to ask your question. While people are warming to that challenge, then let me just, it's a kind of question that goes both ways, I think. So it's something to do with the idea of death. So Joe, in your case, that wonderfully, your interest in seeing death, the Derrida thing, that the people see death and thus become sovereign. And then, as you mentioned at the beginning, and when Haman's name is read out, contrastingly, the people don't see death, but they sound it by erasing the name. So I'm wondering about that contrast between the voice that kills Haman as opposed to the seeing of Haman's. And for Benoit, the role of death and the death of the author, and Barthes' later interest, obviously, in every photograph is a kind of death, he argues. It kills the subject. If you wanted to say a bit more about that in relation to the image of the author and the death of the author. So, Joe, do you want to have a go first?
Yes, thank you, John, for a very difficult question.
Sorry.
That's all right. I mean, I suppose both the sound and the seeing die are both kind of implementations of power. So for Derrida, seeing die is about being able to inflict the punishment on the condemned one. So it's about sovereignty as the wielding of power over other people, and seeing death is the production of a negation, I suppose, isn't it? It's removing that person, whereas the sound is adding to, it's obscuring something that's there with something on top of it. So there is something kind of qualitatively different, I think, and perhaps the sound is less reassuring, is less about taking something away as drowning something out. They're kind of different kind of forces, aren't they? So that's interesting, but I'm not really quite sure in what way.
Yeah, they are different, aren't they? Yeah. Thank you. Benoit, do you want to toy with death? I'm sorry for this macabre opening.
Just a few words. First one, there is, I think, some misunderstanding about the idea of the death of the author, because it was the death of the author with a large A. It was the death of the authority of the author. It was the idea that the author, for Foucault, as for Barthes and for many others, the author was not the master of the meaning. He was not a master of his text. And so we had to liberate, to free the text from a certain massive presence of the authority of the author. But Barthes was always very interested in the person of the author, of the hand of the author, of the body of the author. And you can feel it, especially in the text about Proust or many others, with a lot of biographical details. So the Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes was an attempt to transform this problematic and to say, I have say the death of the author and I will take it from the other side. This is the first point. Second point is that we read very differently a book like Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes after Camera Lucida, because Camera Lucida, which was a book about photography, the essence of photography, but also an autobiographical book about the experience of mourning and the death of the mother. In the second part of Camera Lucida, Barthes is trying to find the perfect image of his mother. But this image is impossible to find in a way, and the only image that he finds is his mother as a little girl, a famous photograph. But he doesn't reproduce this image in his book. He says, I can speak about this image, I can write about what this image means for me, but for you, it would only be, for your reader, it would only be a portrait of a little girl of the beginning of 20th century. And in Roland Barthes, by Roland Barthes, we have some pictures of the mother, because she was alive and the question was different. She is not sacred at that time. And so when we read two books together now, there is a strange shadow on the Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes and a certain age of innocence. And we could also compare the treatment of the death of the father when he was a very small child and the death of his mother when he was already an old man. So it's fascinating because it was impossible for him to imagine that we would read those two books together after his own death at the age of 64.
Thank you. I open the floor. Oh yes, please. Can you kindly go ahead? Can't quite see the name, but please do ask your question.
Yeah, my name is Jean. Hi.
Thank you, Jean.
I had a sort of something got me thinking from what Joe was talking about, and the image of the blank stare is what I wanted to refer to. and you asked what could be possibilities of that blank stare. And that reminded me of a book written by Jack Miles called Christ, A Crisis in the Life of God, where he talks about turning the other cheek in a very different way. And Miles talks about how, those two passages where Jesus says, for example, that if somebody slaps you on your right cheek, you offer him your left cheek as well. Uh, if someone asks you for your shirt, you give him your coat as well. So, what Miles calls this, and in fact, is the strategy of shaming your punisher. So when you look straight into the eye of the punisher, perhaps you, in a sense, might be daring the punisher to punish you even more, or challenging the punisher to see how far he can go into punishing you. So it seemed to me that this could be a possibility, a sort of a strategy of shame that the artist is applying by making the caricature look straight into the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
Thank you. But I have enjoyed both the papers. They were really, really good fun. Thank you so much.
Oh, great, thank you. That's really interesting. Thank you for that suggestion. It's a really I mean, there's lots to think about there in terms of what's going on. So that's really, really useful. I mean, it makes me think of how my daughters look sometimes when I'm telling them off. It's that kind of stare of you know what you're saying there.
I understand completely.
So that resonates quite well with me in terms of being a kind of a recognizable response. Yeah, thank you.
I suppose the Levinas is an obvious haunting figure here, isn't he? The unkillable face. Does that play at all into this?
Yes, I expect so, John. Yes, that's really a good point, actually, and I can't believe I didn't draw on Levinas, actually. Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of shared humanity in that, I think, isn't there, in Levinas's philosophy, that isn't I think the ethos behind the Purim story, or the story, which but it's interesting that you do get this kind of the face of the other that's kind of unmistakable and inescapable in these Esther scrolls. So yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you.
We'll go to Matthew unless Benoit wants to come in at this point.
No, thank
you. You okay?
Let's have another question.
Okay, Matthew, please.
Hi. I also really enjoyed both talks, so thank you very much. There's another question for Joe, I'm afraid, but the quote about or Derrida speaking about the visibility of the death sentence and how that assures sovereignty, particularly in relation to the events of Purim, where the Jews were then able to flip essentially the punishment onto their persecutors and had 2 days of essentially slaughter of their enemies and execution of that judgment. I'm wondering to whom sovereignty in this case actually applies, whether it's to the king, who has really what is rather a minor role, or whether it's to the Jews as a nation state. And I don't know whether that's something that you would care to expound upon. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I look at this in quite a lot of detail, and one of my arguments is that I mean, it's quite complicated what happens in the Esther story, but what happens is the Jews are allowed to defend themselves, and they're allowed to slaughter those that they consider to be against them. And so I kind of argue that is the sovereign decision of death. If you have to identify your enemy and then you're allowed to slaughter them, then you are given a kind of sovereign power. And so I kind of argue that the Jews are given this, that the king actually absents himself from sovereign power in that instance, because that they're allowed to slaughter those who they see as a threat, which is the sovereign imperative. So yeah, I think it does get disseminated, actually, and that it's a kind of abdication of sovereign power on the king's behalf as it's presented. I think the whole story is all about, I think, sovereign power and the problems of sovereign power and, you know, not citizens, they're not citizens, are they, but subjects' rights within the empire, and the problems that come from that. So yeah, thank you. That's a perceptive question, I think, Matthew. So thanks.
Can I ask about pleasure, because that was quite conspicuous for both of you, wasn't it? So, Joe, with the figure, as you're talking about the nude figures, the way they hover over the text and images, and then Benoit, more than once you're talking about your own pleasure in the graphic, in the relation between the word and the image, and then within Barthes, for Barthes, the image is almost the pleasure of the text. So perhaps Benoit first, do you want to, either of you, say any more about the role of pleasure?
Yes, certainly we can connect in Barthes' work the pleasure of the text, le plaisir du texte, and the pleasure of the images. And I think in both directions, Barthes authorized himself to find a new way of writing and reading, and to combine it with the images. And probably the origin of all this is Japan. Because in Japan, he was enjoying the text without understanding it. So the whole society became half a text, half an image. The writing was everywhere, but the pleasure to look at the writing as an image. And I think the pleasure of the handwriting and this very specific drawing, Souvenir de Juan Lépin, that we see on the cover, and Barthes will develop this pleasure of drawing. I think there is a close connection with his love of Japan. This is something that, of course, I should try to develop a little more.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed that part of your paper, Benoit. I thought it was really, the quotations at the beginning, that the idea of the, you know, I'm going to treat the author treating himself with these pictures was, I can't remember the exact quote now, but I thought that was really fantastic. This idea of the pleasure of the author as being part of what you're kind of, what he's declaring.
Yes, he is the character in a novel,
yeah.
And as you know, he uses the form he and not the form I in most of the text. So the image is also concerning he as character, because he's representing himself. It's not, in a way, it's not a self-portrait.
Yes. And I suppose it never is it? I mean, John gave a lecture recently on Borges's self-writing and this idea of the self as a character. I mean, I think that's what's interesting about all texts and the Esther Scrolls. There's a sense in which it's about the Jewish community, it's about the sense of identification and the sense of the character. It's a narrative, isn't it, that's presenting the Jewish people as a character in a story. And I think that's really important to remember that. But pleasure is a strange thing in this scroll, I think, and I haven't quite entirely got my head around it. The kind of story of execution and slaughter, you know, thousands of people are slaughtered at the end, but it is a text of pleasure as well. But yeah.
It's so strange that it, as you say, it unravels into erotic pleasure, it seems.
But then that's all part of the text, isn't it? You know, the virgins of the empire brought to the king, and it's all about, you know, Esther's chosen after spending one night with the king. That's an important part of it. And the reception history of Esther is all about Esther as a sexually problematic figure. So lots of Esthers in literature, like Esther Summerson, I've kind of written on this, but lots of Victorian Esthers are either illegitimate or are sexually problematic. So this sense of her as a, you know, she kind of gets her place in the kingdom by, you know, she sleeps her way into the kingdom, doesn't she, basically? So it is an inherent part of the text as well.
Matthew, did you want to come in with a very quick question? Or that's not?
Yes, just on the phrase of pleasure and Proust and pleasures of the day. Is that the right translation? Plaisir du jour or something on those lines. Sorry for butchering the French. In relation to the image as a static image, if it's ever fair to say that an image is truly static, how does that staticness in essence counter the idea of the days passing, and that is the pleasure of a life lived? Does the image solidify life to a point that it can't be enjoyed? Does that make any sense at all? I'm not entirely sure.
Benoit or Joe?
Yeah, it's just one word. The static image is the privileged image for Barthes. And he said different times, which is very different from his generation, that he preferred photographs to movies. And he had to dream about the image, the fixed image. And probably for him, there is this close connection between writing and still images. And the moving image is going too fast, and you cannot really write with it. You cannot really dream with it. So it's just a smaller idea.
Joe, do you want to respond?
I mean, just in the sense that I think the static image is always quite complex temporally, isn't it? That in the Esther scroll, I think there is this sense of repetition that's a really important part of it as a ritual in the festival, and of the repeated nature of these kind of threat or redemption, or all these ideas are often quite cyclical. So the static image isn't always static, I think, but certainly not in this instant.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Benoit. Thank you, Matthew. So a wonderful papers, and the overlaps are stunning. So thank you very, very much, and thank you everyone for joining us and your questions. And we will hopefully meet again in other ways, in other times. So thank you, bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.